In this video, I'm going to speak very openly about my psychedelic use, but I want to be really careful to make sure that people don't think I'm promoting psychedelics in any shape or form. Of course, there's a lot of research out there that shows that psychedelics can be incredibly effective when used medicinally in a controlled, safe setting with a fully trained professional. But I have to point out that psychedelic laws in various different countries are all very different, and in many countries psychedelics are still incredibly illegal. And be aware of the laws, also be aware of your own psychological health, because psychedelics are not safe for everyone to take. And also people can have, I don't like to say bad trips, but people can have quite extreme negative emotional reactions when they're on psychedelics. If they're with a very safe guide, they can be guided away from those negative emotions. When I've delivered psilocybin assisted therapy, I've been able to very easily guide people back to safety if they've had extreme anxiety or any extreme shame or negative emotions that they would have perhaps found hard to get away from if they weren't with a very safe person or a guide who knew what to do. However, if people are not in a safe setting and they're not with someone who's properly trained in administering psilocybin assisted therapy, then often people can be left with these very difficult emotions that can come up, and they are left with that and it becomes quite a traumatic experience. Another thing to mention is that some people's brains are just not capable of handling psychedelics, and I've come across people who have experienced psychosis after psychedelic use. So it's important to point out that some people's brains are just not strong enough or not suitable for psychedelics. So although I've had incredibly positive, life-transforming experiences from psychedelic use, which I'm now speaking very openly about, psychedelics are not for everyone. So be warned, don't go to some random shaman. You really need to be looking for someone who is actually completely trained and qualified and has really good ethics, actually. So, it's better if someone is a medical professional or a psychological professional and is part of a recognized body with a code of ethics, because often I find people who are administering psychedelics and they have no training in relation to confidentiality, and often I've come across aftercare just being completely neglected. So be very careful if you're considering doing psychedelics. Do your research, look for credible organizations who are administering psychedelics safely in a controlled setting. A year and a half ago, I gave up alcohol, and I made a video on my reasons why I gave up alcohol, but I actually didn't really go into what influenced me to give up alcohol. So I grew up in Ireland, and when you're from Ireland, you pretty much grow up knowing that alcohol is going to be part of your social life. But then actually in my 30s, I never really questioned why I drank alcohol. It just seemed to be something that happened very automatically in social situations, and I never really stood back and questioned it until I started to see a very different way of being. And this was in 2018 when I was in Holland, and I was invited to a party. And this party had a lot of super successful people, a lot of tech people, some really smart people, people who I perceived as being very kind, and people who were making a real impact in the world. Now, I grew up in a family where my dad was actually a policeman. So I grew up with the belief that drugs were bad, because my beliefs about any kind of drugs were that they weren't very good for us, they would lead to problems, they would cause problems with mental health, perhaps cause problems in the brain. Obviously, I was already a very well-established psychologist at this point, so mental health and maintaining positive mental health was of so much importance to me. So I had never considered taking any substances apart from alcohol, which of course is a drug and a social lubricant. So I found myself in 2018 at this party in the Netherlands where there was all these incredible people, and they seemed to be bonding so closely with one another. And I felt on the outside of that I wasn't quite connecting to these people. I was drinking alcohol at the party because I didn't know any different. In every other social situation that was a party-like event in my entire life, I had always drank alcohol. And all of a sudden, I was catapulted into this social situation where no one else was using alcohol and everyone else seemed to be connecting on a much deeper level to me. I was like, there's some really smart, successful, kind people here, and they're taking drugs. And the whole thing completely, it was very confusing for me, because I was like, why would these kind, impactful people, why would they be taking something that's bad? And it led me to, maybe question things a bit more and think about whether all drugs are bad, or actually if there's maybe a difference between some drugs and others. I also was very struck by the fact that I was not connecting with people on the level that other people were at this party. And I kind of, at that point in my life, I never really found myself struggling so hard to connect with people in a social situation than I did on that occasion. But I really noticed people were on a very different level to me. So as I said, I didn't jump on the bandwagon, and I didn't just, try to fit in by taking substances, but I was curious, and I was like, this is very interesting. Magic mushrooms are legal, but not magic mushrooms. It's actually the truffle part of the mushroom, which has the same psychedelic ingredient. So people were taking truffles. We were taking that because it was socially acceptable to take that, and it was leading people to be able to connect on this very deep level. And I was very curious about it, because I was like, okay, I've never been in a situation before in my life where so many people are on drugs and they're being so positive, they're being so kind, they're hugging each other, they're deep in connection. And I was just on the peripheral looking in and being like, the only way I know to socialize is to use alcohol. And that wasn't to say that I was someone who would get drunk. I mean, occasionally I would drink a little bit too much and, be a merry drunk. But actually how I would normally operate in a social situation was have between 1 to 3 drinks. And that was enough of a social lubricant for me to be able to, get on well with people in social situations and navigate social situations quite well. So it was an unusual experience for me. And I think that then led me to actually be curious about psilocybin, magic mushrooms. So I have a company in Amsterdam, in Holland. So I was spending more time in Holland around this period of time. And then that led me to try, at some point later, I ended up trying with a friend, psilocybin, magic mushrooms, they're completely legal in Amsterdam. And it was in a recreational situation, and we had loads of fun. Everything was really good, and it was a really fun experience, which then led me to actually feel quite differently about certain types of substances, particularly psychedelics. And then I started to realize that actually, psychedelics are probably very different to other types of drugs. So, really worlds apart. And then actually started to research things, and I started to look at, what is the probability that someone's going to die when taking psychedelics, and what's the probability of becoming addicted, and then comparing it to drugs such as cocaine and crack and heroin. And I started to realize that they're worlds apart. Of course, you can actually, if you take enough magic mushrooms, you can actually die, but it would be almost impossible to consume the amount that you would need for it to cause a death in someone, because it's such a large quantity. So then I started to see that actually, okay, this is very interesting, very unlikely to kill you, and very unlikely to become addictive. Although actually in recent times, where I'm now actually very immersed in psilocybin research, and I'm around a lot of people who are using psilocybin medicinally, I have actually also come across misuse of psilocybin. And I've come across people who've become emotionally dependent on psilocybin, which I'll go into a little bit more later on in the video. So then I started to see that actually, okay, this is a very interesting way of altering your consciousness compared to alcohol, and that alcohol actually makes people not very conscious. It's very, very different to psilocybin. There was one situation in my life that I had deeply suppressed that was very troubling to me, and that hadn't worked through. It doesn't actually sound like a big trauma. It's more like the minor T trauma. So minor T trauma is something that upsets someone, distresses someone to think about, but if you share it with another person, it might not sound like a big deal. So we're not talking about like war zone or muggings or something that is, horrific, but something that actually has a big emotional impact on someone. And there was this thing in my life that I hadn't worked through at the time, and I can't believe how successful I had been at suppressing it. It was something that was deeply upsetting for me to think about, to the point I never thought about it on a daily basis, and I had successfully suppressed it so deep into my mind that it just didn't come up on a daily basis. And it was never going to come up. I didn't talk about it, I didn't mention it. It was just something that was not really, I didn't look at it. And then the second time that I took magic mushrooms recreationally, when I was distracted and I was having a great time with my friends, everything was good. But then I went to bed and my head hit the pillow, and this thing that I had suppressed came up, and I feel that I was forced to think about it. So then I thought that was quite interesting, because actually I had this great time using magic mushrooms recreationally in a country where it was completely legal to do so, but that the magic mushrooms were not letting me hide from something very painful that I'd held deep within inside. So I was like, interesting. So this is not like alcohol, because you can drink alcohol every weekend or like a couple of nights a week, and it's not confronting you with your deepest, darkest pain. Whereas mushrooms, yes, you can maybe use it recreationally, although I have strong thoughts about that, which I'll share in a moment. But actually, even if you use it recreationally, if you've got stuff that you haven't worked through, it kind of just forces you to go there. So that's what led me to then take up on the opportunity to actually use psilocybin medicinally. So I was still in Holland, and I had the opportunity with a very experienced guide and a very knowledgeable guide to participate in a psilocybin assisted therapy group session, where about 12 of us came together to work on whatever we wanted to release and let go of from our life, and whatever we wanted to let in. So it was a very specific ceremony that we participated in. Some of these people I knew better than other people, and when I had the opportunity to do this ceremony, we had some time during the day to write down what we wanted to work on. And I remember I was basically thinking, okay, there's a lot of people here. I'm probably not going to go with my deepest, darkest thing. That could create a lot of shame. That's kind of scary. How about I just pick something kind of surface level, kind of superficial, that could be a bit beneficial, but let's not go to the deepest, darkest thing, because I'm not ready and that feels terrifying. And then I thought about it, and I thought, well, it seems like a good opportunity, because it wasn't all the time I was being invited to actually be a part of a psilocybin assisted therapy group session with an amazing guide. And in the end, although I was quite anxious, I was like, okay, let's just go for it, and let's just work on this one thing in my life that was coming up anyway when I had used psilocybin recreationally. So I was quite apprehensive, I was quite nervous, and I knew it was going to cause me a lot of distress, a lot of tears, and a lot of pain to address this issue. But we had the psilocybin assisted therapy session, and we all went into the middle of the circle and said what we wanted to work on. And straight away, a lot of pain was brought up for me. And then we went introspective for about 2 hours. We lay on the grass and eyes closed, blindfold, and you're just listening to music as you're processing whatever you have to process. And all my pain related to this one topic came up, and I'm just crying and bawling my eyes out lying on the grass for hours, but I was very comfortable doing so. So all of a sudden, the distress that I had actually feared releasing became very comfortable for me to release. And I was okay with it. Although I did feel like I was the worst person in the ceremony and the most distressed and the most traumatized, even though it wasn't an obviously traumatic thing that I was working on, it was just something that was very painful for me. And I released all this emotion, and 2 hours later, I stand up after the ceremony and I feel great, and it's gone. And the issue had been released so far to the extent that I then felt I could be proactive in my life in addressing that issue further and taking positive steps that I never would have been able to take before. So I achieved all of this positive release, and it was so beneficial for me to be able to have the opportunity to use psilocybin to help me with, it was an area related to grief, and I really grieved during that ceremony. And I also started to learn after the ceremony that actually psilocybin, when you take psilocybin, your altered state of consciousness, or my altered state of consciousness, was very interesting compared to alcohol. Because when you achieve, or when I achieve, an altered state of consciousness from alcohol, it can go in a few different directions. So I guess the first glass of alcohol, you kind of, for me, with my overactive mind, because I have ADHD, it kind of lets some of the thoughts go, but I get a bit clouded from the present moment. So there's kind of pros and cons there. Maybe a calmer mind, but a bit distant from being present. And I've never really healed with alcohol. I can't say any time in my life that I've drank alcohol I've felt healed permanently, or that I've had any kind of cognitive restructuring or any type of neuroplasticity thing has happened. So then, as I started to have these experiences with psilocybin, I started to realize that it actually just seemed like a better state of consciousness, because you end up being guided to look and go quite deep. You're guided to really feel quite painful emotions and release them. You get the opportunity to rethink things and really step outside your normal way of thinking and think much bigger picture and have new thoughts about things and become a lot more open-minded. Fast forward to 2022, I finally came to this point in my life where I just started to look at the altered state of consciousness that's brought about by alcohol in a very different way. And I started to think, wait, I've been using alcohol since I was about 16 years old, and I've been drinking it all this time. It's not the most positive altered state of consciousness when you compare it to certain psychedelics. So actually, do I really need this in my life? And how much benefit is it actually giving me socially? And when I was much younger, I absolutely needed it as a social lubricant. I needed it to shut off some of my social anxiety. I needed it to help me feel more confident. But because I'd actually worked on myself a lot, worked on a lot of issues that I had, I realized that alcohol was not really doing anything for me in social situations, and that it probably wasn't the best altered state of consciousness that I could achieve. But I didn't know if I could give it up or not, because I'm Irish and it's so conditioned in me, and it's just deeply ingrained in the cultures that I've lived in, both the UK and Ireland, that when we go into a social situation, we drink alcohol. So I gave up alcohol a year and a half ago. I didn't know how I would do. I didn't know how it would be. But as soon as I gave it up, I didn't miss anything about it. And I realized that actually it just wasn't an altered state of consciousness that I enjoyed anymore. And then I realized that actually psilocybin was something that I preferred to use only medicinally. So I stopped using psilocybin recreationally in countries where it's legal. And I realized that actually I prefer it just for ceremonial medicinal purposes, and quite infrequently as well, because actually I've seen with some people, they become dependent on psilocybin because it's so good at actually making people feel better, that if people achieve good results on working on their trauma with psilocybin, they sometimes then become dependent on it, and they start using it to help with other negative emotions on a regular basis. So actually, while a lot of people will tell you that psilocybin is not addictive, I've actually seen a number of people become dependent on psilocybin, and rather than working through emotions properly while they're sober, they go to psilocybin too often. And this is where psilocybin use comes with a warning that actually, yes, it's very good to use it for stuff that's happened in the past that you haven't been able to work through. But if you have a fight with your friend last week and it's still troubling you today, you shouldn't go and start using psilocybin to try and get over it. It's actually much better to try and process those emotions yourself. Otherwise, what we start to see is a psilocybin dependency. And not many people are talking about that. So I don't want to sound like I'm promoting psilocybin. It can be very useful to help overcome trauma that you otherwise can't overcome, but don't use it too often, because actually you do desensitize to it, you build a tolerance, and then it's not going to be as powerful when you want to use it medicinally. I also no longer believe in using psilocybin recreationally, because recreationally, it's kind of like misusing the substance, because it's such a powerful medicinal substance. It also means that people might use it too regularly, and then it's not as powerful when they want to use it medicinally. It's also, we're very sensitive to energy, other people's energy, when we take psilocybin. So if you're around the wrong people, or people who are carrying quite heavy or negative energy, you will feel very sensitive to that. And often people, when they take psilocybin and they think it's going to be a great thing recreationally, they actually just want to go sit by a tree or sit by a lake and be by themselves, because they're so sensitive to other people's energy. And actually people seem to feel very suited being around nature when they've taken psilocybin. So psilocybin use comes with lots of warnings. Psychedelics are not for everyone. Psychedelics can bring on psychosis in some people. People need to be really careful about certain conditions that they have. Certain complex mental illness that people carry means that they might not be good candidates for psychedelics. There's also a lot of shamans out there who offer psychedelics but then don't actually have the proper knowledge and experience to administer them safely. And there's been a lot of situations where I have heard of or witnessed or had information about where people have used psychedelics and then they haven't had the right aftercare. So then they haven't been able to integrate the messages that they've received from psychedelics. And therefore, they end up being quite confused about the information that they've received or the thinking processes that they've gone through while under the influence of psychedelics. So I think we have a long way to go in relation to helping make psychedelics be really safe, to actually be able to give people access to use them in a very safe and responsible and ethical way. There's no clear universal guidelines that are global, although there's certain organizations that are better than others in relation to trying to help people take psychedelics in a very safe way. And also an important thing to mention is that the work that I ended up doing and the aha moment, the light bulb moment of, wait, alcohol no longer has a place in my life anymore, this didn't come up during a psilocybin assisted therapy session or while I was under the influence of psilocybin. The work happened afterwards. For me, it was many years after first using psilocybin that I gradually came to the conclusion that I could distance myself from alcohol, or I kind of, actually another way of saying it is just alcohol left my life. I didn't really feel like I was giving up anything. I've had no cravings, I've had no temptation, and I actually do have a glass of red wine with a meal occasionally because I like the taste of it and I drink it very slowly, but it's not something that comes to mind that often, and it's not every time I go out to dinner with friends or anything like that. So I still have very small quantities of alcohol, but for me it has to be so small that I'm actually not really noticing any type of effect from alcohol, and it only takes a glass and a half for me to actually feel like I'm drunk these days. A final thing to mention about psilocybin is that it pretty much is serotonin. It activates a subset of serotonin receptors, and this is what brings about the neuroplasticity that we receive from taking psilocybin. So in relation to my psilocybin experiences, I would have to say that my brain became incredibly neuroplastic. I was very set in my ways, particularly with my alcohol use previously. And there were certain things that I couldn't even conceptualize, such as the idea that social situations would be great without alcohol. Like, that just wasn't in my mind. I had very limiting beliefs about alcohol, that like I couldn't have fun without it. I wouldn't be very interesting without it in social situations. I would be limiting social situations, and that it would kind of make my life worse if I was without it. So I was rigid in my thinking, and I would say that psilocybin gave me great neuroplasticity in relation to opening my mind in relation to my alcohol use and starting to see that actually things could be very different, and helping me see a very different perspective on my behavior with alcohol, and that actually I could enjoy life, or I could enjoy social situations even more without alcohol. And that's not a way of thinking that I probably would have been able to reach if I hadn't used psilocybin. Of course, psilocybin has influenced me in lots of other ways, which I'll talk about in other videos. But for now, I just wanted to share the story about how I came to give up alcohol and how it was a gradual thing of actually using psilocybin, mostly medicinally, that has helped me get to this place. If you've any questions about anything that I've spoken about in this video, you can leave comments below. And if you've liked this video and want to see more of my content, please subscribe to my channel.